The attorney stopped beside my table, glanced down at the stack of pleadings in front of me, and smiled with the easy recognition of someone greeting a colleague. "Good afternoon, counselor." The room went silent. Across the aisle, my Aunt Diane's confident smile froze halfway across her face. Richard looked from the attorney to me, then back again. "Counselor," he repeated, almost laughing, "you must have the wrong person." The attorney frowned slightly. "No, Ms. Bennett and I have appeared in court together before." Diane let out a short, nervous laugh. "Our niece isn't a lawyer." I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my leather folder, arranged my exhibits in order, and placed my legal pads squarely in front of me. The attorney's expression shifted from polite confusion to realization as he noticed Diane's reaction. He had assumed they already knew. They didn't. 19 years earlier, they had thrown me out of their house with a newborn baby because I refused to give my daughter away. Now they had brought me into court because they believed I was the only obstacle standing between them and my grandfather's lake cabin, along with the $745,000 he had left me. They had spent weeks telling relatives I would fold the moment lawyers became involved. Instead, they had unknowingly walked into a courtroom where I wasn't just the defendant. I was one of the attorneys. Before another word could be spoken, the courtroom doors opened. "All rise." The bailiff's voice echoed through the room as everyone stood. The judge entered, nodded once toward both counsel tables, and took his seat. "You may be seated." Chairs scraped quietly across the polished floor. I remained calm, flipping one final page in my binder, while Diane kept staring at me as though waiting for someone to explain what she had just witnessed. She leaned toward Richard. "She's bluffing," she whispered, not quietly enough. Richard nodded, forcing confidence back into his face. "She's sitting beside her lawyer, that's all." Neither of them noticed that there was no empty chair waiting for another attorney. Every seat at my table was already occupied. Their own lawyer finally looked across the room again. "Mrs. Bennett," he said carefully, "I assumed you knew Ms. Bennett practices civil litigation." Diane blinked. "What?" "I've seen her argue motions before." Richard's jaw tightened. "No, that's impossible." I met his eyes for the first time that morning. The last time he had looked at me with that much certainty, I had been 17 years old, standing on his front porch with my newborn daughter wrapped in a hospital blanket while he locked the front door behind us. He had believed I would come back the next day and sign the adoption papers. I never did. Instead, I disappeared from their lives. Or at least, that's what they believed. For 19 years, there had been no birthday cards. No holiday calls. No apologies. No explanations. Then my grandfather died. Everything changed. His final will left me the family's lake cabin, a place everyone assumed would pass to Diane and Richard, and a cash inheritance totaling $745,000. Within weeks, they filed a lawsuit. According to them, I had manipulated an elderly man into changing his estate. According to them, I didn't deserve a single dollar. According to them, the frightened teenager they had once thrown onto the street was still someone they could intimidate. They had no idea my grandfather's estate wasn't the only thing waiting for them inside this courtroom. The judge opened the case file. "Good morning. We are here regarding the Bennett estate." He looked toward the plaintiff's table. "Counsel." Then his gaze shifted toward mine. "Please state your appearances for the record." 19 years earlier, I stood on the front porch of my aunt and uncle's house with my 3-day-old daughter sleeping against my shoulder. I had imagined that bringing the baby home would be frightening. I hadn't imagined the dining room table would already be covered with paperwork. My Aunt Diane folded her hands neatly. "Sit down, Flore." I lowered myself into the chair, careful not to wake my daughter. "What is all this?" Richard slid a folder across the table. "These are adoption consent forms." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. My what? The baby's adoption papers, Diane answered calmly. We've already spoken with a family. My heart pounded. You already, what? They're educated, financially secure. They'll give her everything you can't. I wrapped my arm tighter around my daughter. I'm not giving her away. Neither of them reacted with surprise. It was as though they had expected resistance. Diane sighed. You are 17. I know. You have no income. I'll work. You haven't even finished school. I will. You cannot raise a child. I can learn. Richard leaned forward. No, Flore, listen carefully. He tapped the paperwork with one finger. You have two choices. He pointed toward the forms. You sign these. Then he pointed toward the front door. Or you leave. The room became painfully quiet. I looked down at my daughter. Her tiny fingers had curled around one strand of my sweater. She trusted me completely. I couldn't imagine breaking that trust before she had even learned my face. I'm keeping her. Diane's expression hardened. Think carefully. I already have. You'll destroy your future. If that's the price. Richard interrupted. No. He stood abruptly. If you refuse this adoption, you don't live under this roof. I searched both of their faces for even a trace of hesitation. There wasn't any. No compromise. No discussion. No offer of temporary help. Only conditions. Choose your daughter. Or choose your home. I picked up my diaper bag. I've made my choice. Richard walked past me without another word. A few seconds later, I heard the deadbolt click. By the time I reached the front porch, my suitcase had already been placed beside the steps. The front door closed. Then another lock turned. I stood there in the cold evening air, holding my newborn while staring at the house where I had grown up. No one opened the door again. The first week blurred into exhaustion. A church volunteer found me a bed in an emergency shelter. Another woman gave me baby clothes her own daughter had outgrown. Someone else left diapers beside my cot without saying a word. Strangers showed me more kindness than my own family. During the day, I filled out job applications. At night, I rocked my daughter to sleep while trying not to cry loudly enough to wake the other mothers. Graduation came and went. I wasn't there. Instead of wearing a cap and gown, I was filling coffee cups before sunrise and cleaning offices after sunset, whenever someone would let me work. Sleep became a luxury. Giving up never became an option. Months later, I learned why no relatives had answered my calls. Diane had been answering them first. She told everyone I had run away because I wanted freedom. She said I had rejected every offer of help. She even claimed I refused to let anyone meet the baby. People believed her. One by one, every door closed. Except one. Years later, completely out of nowhere, my grandfather called me directly. Not through Diane. Not through Richard. Me. His first words weren't about money. Or family arguments. Or the past. He simply asked, Flore, how are you and my great-granddaughter? I remember staring at the phone in complete silence. How did he suddenly know where I was? And why, after so many years, had he stopped believing everything Diane had told him? My grandfather's funeral had barely ended before the certified envelope arrived. Notice of WALL contest. I read the first page once, then a second time. Diane and Richard were asking the probate court to invalidate my grandfather's final will. According to their petition, he had been manipulated into changing his estate plan during the last years of his life. Their filing described me as an opportunist, someone who had isolated an elderly man for financial gain, someone who had taken advantage of his declining health. I set the papers down and looked across my office. One of the junior associates frowned. "They're accusing you of undue influence." "I know. They're making it sound like you stole everything." I nodded. "They're hopping people believe it before they ever see the evidence." It worked. Within days, relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions. One cousin left a voicemail. "I don't know what really happened, Flore, but if Grandpa was confused, maybe giving the cabin back would end all this." An older aunt sent a text. "Families shouldn't fight over money." No one asked why my grandfather had changed his will, only why I hadn't surrendered it. Meanwhile, Diane was telling anyone willing to listen that justice would expose me. At a family gathering held after the funeral, she stood near the refreshment table, speaking just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "She thinks having lawyers will scare us." Richard folded his arms. "The judge will see through her act." Several relatives glanced toward me. No one defended me. I simply picked up my coat and left. I had learned years earlier that arguing with a rumor only gives it a larger audience. Evidence speaks more clearly than outrage. The morning of the hearing, Diane and Richard looked completely at ease. Their attorney confidently opened the case. "Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate that the decedent's final testament does not reflect his independent wishes." He began attacking the timing of the revised estate documents. He questioned why the changes favored me so heavily. He suggested my grandfather had become vulnerable in his final years. I listened without interrupting, making notes beside each point. When he finished, my supervising partner leaned toward me. "You ready?" I smiled. "I've been ready for months." We stood. Instead of responding emotionally, we addressed each procedural issue with documents already organized in chronological order. Every objection raised by Diane's attorney had already been anticipated. Every filing he questioned had supporting records. Every date matched. Every signature had corroboration. Halfway through the exchange, I noticed something change. Their attorney wasn't looking at Diane anymore. He was looking at me. Carefully. Respectfully. Almost curiously. During a brief pause, he flipped through several pleadings again before speaking. "Your Honor," he said, "before we proceed further, I believe Counsel Bennett intends to address the evidentiary foundation for Exhibit 12. The courtroom grew still. Diane frowned. "Counsel Bennett." Slowly. She turned toward me. I rose from my chair. For the first time since entering the courtroom, every pair of eyes followed me instead of the attorneys beside me. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Diane whispered, almost to herself, "No." The realization spread across the courtroom one face at a time. I wasn't sitting behind my legal team. I was part of it. The frightened teenager they had once ordered out of their house was now standing in a courtroom as one of the lawyers defending the very inheritance they believed they could take from her. I buttoned my jacket, picked up a single document from my binder, and stepped toward the lectern. "Your Honor," I said evenly, "I'd like to introduce Exhibit 12. The courtroom clerk accepted the document and handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. I waited until everyone had the exhibit in front of them. "It is a notarized letter written by my grandfather, Harold Bennett," I said. "The letter was signed 3 years before his death and stored with his estate planning attorney." The judge adjusted his glasses. "I have it." Across the aisle, Diane leaned toward her attorney. "What letter?" He didn't answer. He was already reading. I continued. "Your Honor, this document explains, in my grandfather's own words, why he amended his estate plan." The judge nodded. "You may proceed." I took a slow breath. "My grandfather writes that he became concerned after repeated attempts to contact me were blocked. He found it unusual that every conversation had to go through my legal guardians, Diane and Richard Bennett. Diane shifted in her chair. "That's ridiculous," she muttered. Her attorney raised a hand without looking at her. "Please." I kept reading. I feared I was no longer receiving truthful information regarding my granddaughter's circumstances. Therefore, I retained an independent investigator to verify the facts before making any changes to my estate. The room fell silent. Richard looked sharply at Diane. "You never mentioned this." She stared straight ahead. "I didn't know." The next section of the letter explained what the investigation uncovered. Not rumors. Documents. The investigator obtained hospital discharge records, confirming I had left the maternity ward without stable housing. Church shelter records showed where my daughter and I had stayed during those first weeks. Guardianship documents confirmed Diane and Richard had been legally responsible for me while I was still a minor. The investigator interviewed shelter staff, who remembered a teenage mother arriving with nothing but one suitcase and a newborn. He collected written statements from neighbors who remembered seeing my belongings placed outside the house. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. I had not abandoned my family. My guardians had abandoned me. The judge slowly turned another page. No one spoke. I continued reading. I have also learned that several members of my family were falsely informed that Flore voluntarily left home and rejected every offer of assistance. A quiet murmur spread through the gallery. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. One elderly cousin lowered her head. Another covered her mouth with her hand. They had believed that story for nearly 2 decades. Now they were seeing the truth in my grandfather's own handwriting. Diane's confidence disappeared. She looked toward her attorney. "Say something." He remained focused on the exhibit. There was nothing to say. The final pages explained something I hadn't even known until after my grandfather passed away. He had not changed his will immediately after learning the truth. He spent months rebuilding our relationship first. He visited quietly. He met his great-granddaughter. He watched us build a life together. He attended my law school graduation without announcing himself to the rest of the family. He celebrated privately when I passed the bar examination. Those moments had belonged only to us. Then came the final paragraph. I intentionally prepared this estate with extensive documentation because I believe Diane and Richard Bennett will challenge these decisions after my death. Every bequest reflects my own informed judgment. Should litigation occur, I ask the court to consider not only my wishes, but the conduct that made these changes necessary. I closed the letter. Your Honor, that concludes Exhibit 12. Opposing counsel remained seated. He slowly removed his glasses. Then he looked toward Diane. "Mrs. Bennett." She leaned forward desperately. "Tell the judge he was manipulated." He spoke quietly. "I cannot make an argument that the evidence does not support." Richard's face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" "The investigator. The notarized statement. The independent witnesses. The medical evaluations. The estate attorney." He shook his head once. "This wasn't prepared for today's hearing." He looked at the stack of exhibits. "It was prepared years ago." The realization settled over Diane and Richard like a weight they could no longer escape. My grandfather had expected this lawsuit. He had answered every accusation long before it was ever spoken. The judge closed the file. He folded his hands and looked directly across the courtroom. His eyes settled on Diane and Richard. Then he began to speak. No one moved. The judge rested both hands on the file before him and allowed the silence to settle over the courtroom. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "The court has reviewed the documentary evidence, the testimony presented, the estate planning records, and Exhibit 12. He looked toward Diane and Richard. "The evidence is both substantial and consistent. He paused. There is no credible basis to conclude that Harold Bennett lacked testamentary capacity or that his final will was the product of undue influence. Diane's shoulders stiffened. The judge continued. To the contrary, the record demonstrates that Mr. Bennett anticipated this litigation and took extraordinary measures to document his intentions. He closed the file. Accordingly, the petition to invalidate the will is denied. The sound of his gavel, striking the bench, echoed through the courtroom. For the record, he added, the decedent's final estate plan shall be enforced exactly as written. Diane stood so abruptly her chair slid backward. This isn't fair. The judge looked up. Mrs. Bennett, you have been heard. You don't understand. She turned him against us. Before the judge could respond, her own attorney quietly placed a hand on her sleeve. Diane. She pulled away. No, tell him. He looked at her with the tired expression of someone who had reached the end of every honest argument. I can't. Richard stared at him. What do you mean you can't? Because the documents don't support what you've claimed. He gestured toward the exhibits. They contradict it. He lowered his voice. Every single one. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I had walked into that courtroom, neither of them had anything left to say. I turned toward the gallery. My daughter, now 19 years old, was sitting in the second row. She smiled through tears. Not because we had won the inheritance. Because something much older had finally ended. When she was born, people had spoken about her as though she were a mistake that needed to disappear. Now she watched her mother stand in a courtroom as an attorney, defending the very decision to keep her. When the hearing ended, she walked over and wrapped her arms around me. You did it. I smiled. We did. She laughed softly. I kept thinking about what they wanted all those years ago. I know. If you had listened. I gently shook my head. I never could have. She squeezed my hand. I'm glad. So am I. Outside the courtroom, several relatives waited in the hallway. For a long moment, no one knew what to say. Then my older cousin stepped forward. I owe you an apology. I looked at him quietly. I believed what Diane told us. Another relative nodded. So did I. An aunt wiped away tears. We thought you had chosen to leave. I answered honestly. I know. No anger. No raised voice. Just 19 years of truth, finally reaching the people who had never heard it. One by one, they apologized. Some hugged me. Others simply lowered their heads, ashamed they had never questioned the story they had been given. Diane and Richard walked past us without speaking. No one followed them. For years, they had controlled the family's version of the past. That control ended the moment the evidence spoke for itself. A month later, the court entered its final order. The lake cabin officially became mine. The inheritance, $745,000, was distributed exactly as my grandfather had directed. Diane and Richard were ordered to pay substantial legal costs after their unsuccessful challenge. They left the case with no share of the estate, no claim to the property, and a reputation that would never fully recover. The loss wasn't simply financial. The people who had trusted them for years now knew why my grandfather had changed his will. His decision hadn't been impulsive. It had been deliberate, carefully documented, and entirely justified. I could have sold the cabin. Financially, it would have made sense. Instead, I restored it. The old porch where my grandfather and I had once watched the lake became the entrance to something new. A few months later, we hosted our first free legal clinic for young single parents. Volunteer attorneys donated their weekends. Local organizations offered childcare. Families came with questions about housing, custody, guardianship, employment, and education. Many arrived carrying the same fear I once carried, the fear of believing they were completely alone. My daughter greeted every family who walked through the front door. She organized children's activities while parents met with lawyers inside. Sometimes I would look across the room and remember the adoption papers Diane had pushed across the dining table 19 years earlier. One signature would have erased everything standing in front of me. Instead, one decision had built all of it. Late one summer evening, after the final families had gone home, I locked the cabin and stepped onto the porch overlooking the lake. Inside, hanging above the fireplace, was a framed copy of my grandfather's final will. Not because of the money, not because of the property, because it represented the first adult who had chosen to believe me instead of the story others told about me. My daughter joined me outside. "You think great-grandpa would like what this place has become?" I smiled toward the quiet water. "I think this is exactly what he hoped for." She slipped her arm through mine. We stood there together until the sun disappeared behind the trees. Then I looked back at the cabin, smiled, and said quietly, "The day they locked me out, they thought they were ending my future. They never imagined they were opening the door to it."